Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55% so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
John Diefenbaker still holds the record for winning the largest majority ever in Canadian history. And yet his legacy, his time in office, is greatly misunderstood. Hello, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. In his new book, Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence, author Bob Plamondon dives into trying to save Diefenbaker's legacy. Ask most people what Diefenbaker is all about, and you might hear about the Avro Arrow, you might hear about the Diefendollar, but you're not going to hear about his many accomplishments. Bob Plamondon wants to change that. Here's our chat about his new book. Bob, would you say that John George Diefenbaker was an unlikely politician, an unlikely prime minister?
Well, when you think that he grew up poor born in small town Ontario, grew up in small town Saskatchewan, didn't go to an elite college or university for education, was a perpetual outsider and did not come from British or French origin. The first person actually even to be in cabinet who was neither. That he ran for 5 elections, went 0 for 5 before he came into the House of Commons, and was largely despised by the elite and the power structure within the Conservative Party, then I would say, yes, it was unlikely that he became Prime Minister.
We look at his name now, everyone's used to Diefenbaker. That would have been a name that would set a lot of people back in the 1950s. An ethnic name. He's one of them Germans.
Well, of course, we had just gone through 2 world wars against Germany, and he's got this Germanic surname. But that was part of who he was. He did not like hyphenated Canadians. He did not like any form of discrimination or prejudice. So, he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder when it came to that, but it was a lot to overcome to have that as part of your legacy. Of course, half of his legacy was German, the other half was Scottish, but he was all Canadian all the way.
I've always liked that about him. I say that as someone whose parents are direct immigrants, and my parents never liked the idea of hyphenated Canadians. And I guess they passed that on to me. I know that you listened to the podcast episode by my colleague Tristan Hopper, Canada Did What, on Diefenbaker. Do you agree with the way he portrays it, that Diefenbaker is the biggest political rock star this country's ever seen, and that at the height of his popularity, it was bigger than Trudeau-mania?
So, of the full episode on that one particular issue, I do agree with him. And then, so he won in 1957 when the Conservatives had lost 8 of the previous 9 elections. It was only R.B. Bennett that squeaked in there in 1930 during the Depression, but Liberals had owned the electoral landscape in Canada. So in 1957, the Liberals were assured of victory with Louis Saint Laurent. Lo and behold, Diefenbaker wins this minority government, and people are really surprised at that. 9 months later, there's another election where he does win the largest majority in Canadian history, bar none, in terms of percentage of the seats. So it was just a complete electoral landslide. And there was an attachment to Diefenbaker, a charisma about Diefenbaker that we'd had these politicians, that spoke down to people in some respects, that they didn't have, his flair. He talked about representing the poor, the disadvantaged, those who, ordinary Canadians. He said, I represent ordinary Canadians. I can't help it. I'm one of them. And, he was running against a fellow who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, Lester Pearson. But Lester Pearson didn't have that connection with ordinary Canadians. He didn't speak their language or have their aspirations. So people thought, with John Diefenbaker, we've got somebody who knows us, who will represent us, who understands who we are, who's going to make our life better. So he was a rock star to the point where, he could deliver a speech like no other at the time. He was funny. He was, he could deliver lines like lightning bolts against his opponents. So, he just captured hearts and minds to the point that people went to his rallies. They said they just wanted to be near him. They wanted to touch his coat. He was a folk hero in his time. And even in Quebec, where the Tories had been nowhere in Quebec since the days of Sir John A. Macdonald, he picks up 50 of Quebec's 75 seats. Now, of course, he had Maurice Duplessis on his team helping him out, the Premier of Quebec. But yes, so Tristan Hopper's right. That was an election like we've never seen before.
Oh, I encourage everyone to go listen to that episode. It's a lot of fun. Unlike this podcast, Tristan has fun.
I'm having fun.
You said he had the Premier of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, on his side, but he didn't have the Central Canadian power brokers. And just from your preface, you write, the Premier of Ontario, Leslie Frost, remarked, "Sometimes I really do think he's crazy." Party organizer Eddie Goodman responded, "Why only sometimes?" They didn't want him near the leadership of the Conservative Party when he ran in 1956. He'd run previously and lost. But after George Drew stepped down, a guy who had previously been Premier of Ontario but couldn't win a federal election, they wanted to work hard to stop him. Why did they dislike him so much in the party brass when people were obviously drawn to him?
So the party brass did not like him for two reasons. One, he came to Ottawa as an MP and did his work, but he really did not ingratiate himself to his fellow members of Parliament. He didn't try to win them over. His connection was with the rank and file members of the party. So they didn't see him necessarily as a team player. They saw him as a guy certainly with a vision and a passion and a great orator, but they weren't sure that they could trust him. I'd say more so the opposition came from, let's just say, the bastion of the Albany Club in Toronto, which was sort of like Tory headquarters. So the bankers, business people, the wealthy, the people that had great academic credentials were wary of him because he was talking about helping people across the country in ways that the conservatives had not done before, that the conservatives were laissez-faire. They didn't think that poverty was something that politicians addressed. This is just people just worked hard and free enterprise would take care of everything and everybody. So here he came forward with a completely different message and vision that countered what was the established Tory tradition. So, they thought he was a little bit crazy for some of the ideas and some of the sentiments that he produced. And there's beyond the quotes of Drew and Goodman and others. They would say Diefenbaker wants it. Let's let the crazy son of a bitch have it. He's going to lose the next election anyway, and we'll come back and charge. There's no point in kicking against the pricks who want him. This is the rank and file members. Diefenbaker's got them, sort of in their back pocket. He's going to win, so let him have his shot, and we'll be done with him. But lo and behold, he wins it. Wins the next election. Well, actually wins 3 in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't even forget that, Brian, because in 1963, when he's prime minister, he faces a revolt from within his own party while he's prime minister that precipitated his downfall in that election.
In terms of his style and some of what you've described, as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking Pierre Poilievre. Now, Pierre didn't win in this last election, but Poilievre is someone who obviously studied Diefenbaker and appreciated him. He invoked him often, not quite as often as Sir Wilfrid Laurier's Canada's Freedom stand, but did you get that sense watching Poilievre over the last couple of years that he was, like Stephen Harper before him, inspired by Diefenbaker?
So certainly Pierre Poilievre would quote Diefenbaker's mantra that he spoke of when he passed the Bill of Rights about, how he was a free Canadian, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom to pursue my passion. These freedoms that he bequeathed to all Canadians, and that was certainly a central theme in Pierre Poilievre's campaign and his mission, and I think his entire political life. And one thing about Diefenbaker is that he was not particularly ideological. And you think of the various factions of conservatism and say, which one do you represent? I would say that Diefenbaker didn't represent any of them, particularly strongly. He was a populist in the sense that he wanted to solve people's problems, and he didn't come to office with a prefixed set of ideas. In fact, he launched more royal commissions than any other prime minister before or since, because he did want to have the benefit of the experts. He wanted to study the problems, and he wanted to see what would work. So I'm not sure that that would have been Pierre's approach had he become prime minister. But there is a lot about the way that they address crowds. They both attracted large crowds, and they've attracted a following, and people invested a lot of hope in them. And they didn't say things that you would get out of central casting from a politician. So in that respect, there are some similarities.
Yeah, well, I understand what you're saying about different styles of populism. I think Pierre had more ideology rooted within him, but yeah, it's just some of the ways that he acted, comparing to what you were describing. Thinking back to my time visiting the Diefenbaker Center at the University of Saskatchewan, and it's just an amazing experience that anyone should go and see. Being able to sit behind his desk, being able to sit at his cabinet table, seeing all the artifacts. We don't do that a lot for our prime ministers. Of course, we tend to forget about them as soon as they've left office. Have you been through the center?
So I haven't been through the center, other than virtually, and talking with people who are resident there. But there's one thing about Diefenbaker. He certainly appreciated not only Canadian history, but world history and his place in it. And in fact, he offered to donate his home to the government of Canada for $1 to serve as a place where Canadians could come and visit in Ottawa, where he lived. And of course, that was turned down by the government of Canada, which is unfortunate. And we don't do that. I mean, there is a center in Shawinigan for Prime Minister Chrétien that and we also have the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, which had lots of money attached to it. But otherwise, we haven't put up a statue on Parliament Hill to a prime minister since Pearson. So Canadian history has taken a bad rap. But
so we've got an airport named for Pearson, the biggest airport in the country.
Yeah.
I'm sitting steps from an area, University of Toronto, where they've got the Lester B. Pearson Peace Garden. It's a beautiful spot. My dog and I love to sit there in the mornings and sip coffee. Well, I sip the coffee. The dog doesn't.
Yeah.
All these things named for Pearson. Diefenbaker was demonstrably more successful in terms of electoral terms, but is it just that Liberals get all of these platitudes, all of these honors, and Conservatives don't, because Conservatives aren't in power as often or won't do this, and Liberals want to, elevate Pearson and Trudeau and talk about their wonderful legacies?
Well, it's true that since the days of Macdonald, Liberals had held power, at least 2/3 of the time. So they've had not only the opportunity to govern, but the Conservatives had fewer opportunities to recognize their own. As far as Diefenbaker is concerned, one of the challenges that we have is there hasn't been a real honest assessment and an evidence-based assessment of his record. He's seen in popular Canadian literature as a bit of a buffoon, a cartoon character, a man out of step with his times, a bit of a lunatic. So if with that sentiment that was established, I think largely because of a book that Peter C. Newman wrote, Renegade in Power, that that the press popularized. The CBC certainly they created a documentary series on the Avro Arrow that was slanderous and a gross act of fiction that sort of cemented what people thought about John Diefenbaker. So he needed to be rescued, not from the slander. I mean, there's things you can say positive and negative about him, but it was all negative. It was only when Stephen Harper became prime minister that quite, I think, cleverly, they renamed or named the building that sits right beside the Lester B. Pearson building where Foreign Affairs is located. And the building that's right beside it, they renamed the John George Diefenbaker building. So they are side by side, institutionally, staring at each other, these two massive structures that house Foreign Affairs.
Well, and of course, I went to many news conferences where they would invoke the name of Diefenbaker during the Harper government, and they would talk about his Bill of Rights, which you wouldn't know had ever been passed. But this is a man who appointed the first Chinese Canadian to cabinet, the first woman to cabinet, gave Aboriginals the vote. I mean, maybe I know more about Diefenbaker because he seemed to have a bit of a lore in Hamilton, where I grew up, because there was Ellen Fairclough. She was the first woman appointed to cabinet. Who put her there? John Diefenbaker or Sean O'Sullivan, who was a hero, especially for those of us going through the Catholic school system, who Diefenbaker had been talking to and listening to since he was a teenager at Bishop Bryan High School. Maybe I just know more of that, but you're correct. It is this constant, you mentioned Diefenbaker's name, and people will go off about the Avro Arrow. In fact, I want to play a clip of Jason Kenney from that Canada Did What podcast that I mentioned earlier here, where Kenney's talking about the fact that until maybe 20, 25 years ago, you'd still have people say, I haven't voted Tory since Diefenbaker canceled the Arrow. Here it is.
Let me say that it was a great tradition of conservative campaigns to see how many times would you get a comment at the door, I haven't voted Tory since Diefenbaker scrapped the Avro Arrow. Now, I think the last time I heard that was probably circa 2000, but that legend lived on in Canadian politics for several decades, that you could talk to almost any Conservative candidate, federally or provincially, for the better part of the latter half of the 20th century, and they will have heard voters say right up into the late 90s, I've never voted Tory since Diefenbaker scrapped the Arrow.
So is that part of the reason for this book, and setting the record straight on things like the Arrow, setting the record straight on his passion for fundamental rights and freedoms, for human rights? Is that part of the reason that you did this book?
So it is part of the reason, but I start with the premise, Brian, that Canada in itself is an improbable country, given our geography, our diversity, language, and somehow we've been able to bring this country together and make it an incredibly successful, much admired nation, beating all the odds because we've had, over our history, exceptional political leadership at various points in time. And we can learn from our history to help us solve the problems of today. So the more we know about Canada, where we've come from, I think the less we apologize for Canada, the more we celebrate Canada, the more that we come together as a country, and part of that is knowing and understanding the true history. So I think John Diefenbaker is much misunderstood. The issues that he faced, the decisions that he made, the foundation that he laid out, that whether it was well, we can talk about the arrow, but the roads to resources that opened up the North and our resources to development, the way that he stood up to an American administration that was quite belligerent about Canada, about Diefenbaker, and the most severe form of election interference in Canadian history, comes at a time when John Diefenbaker is in power. His efforts to diversify trade away from the United States around the world, which seems pretty topical these days,
Yes.
all come from Diefenbaker. Our social safety net, the hospitalization coverage, that was a precursor to Medicare, comes from John Diefenbaker. These things are not well understood. What we do know, because of the CBC's docuseries, and others, is we know that he canceled the arrow and he sacked the governor of the Bank of Canada. And how could a prime minister ever have done that? And when you look at the evidence, as I do in the and standing up to an American administration, and not having American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, these are all Diefenbaker decisions that put him on the right side of history and have not been reversed by his successors in any way.
This may upset a certain political columnist, but he was right to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, in my view.
He was 100% correct. At the time, you had a governor of the Bank of Canada that if anyone had gone rogue, it was James Coyne, who was a lawyer and was made governor of the Bank of Canada because the Liberal government of the day did not want to have a Jew, Louis Razminski, as the governor of the Bank of Canada, who was eminently more qualified. And here you had the James Coyne talking down the Canadian economy, speaking out critically of the government of Canada's fiscal policy, not impact on monetary policy, and instituted erratic monetary policy where we saw the interest rates in Canada fluctuate from 2% to 6% to 2% all over the map and quite distinct from what was going on in the United States, to the point that he did something no other Bank of Canada governor could do, is he united economists across the country to come together, all who say we value our independence, but we think this man is doing tremendous damage to the Canadian economy and he needs to be sacked. And the only way, before he became governor, he said, if I was ever in disagreement with the government of the day, I would do the honorable thing and resign. The government of the day asked him to resign and he refused. And so Diefenbaker, at the end, for that and other reasons, passed a bill in the House of Commons to declare the office of the Bank of Canada vacant.
And did he have a message for the Canadian public about the recession and the economy at the time?
Well, so the governor of the Bank of Canada essentially said, you're going to have to consume less, you're going to have to spend less, you're going to have to borrow less, your standard of living is going to have to decline. Because, as he saw it, the government deficit was too large, but in relative terms, it wasn't large at all. It was quite minor. And his message is that from the governor of the Bank of Canada is we have to kick the Americans effectively or diminish their role in investment in Canada so that we have a made in Canada economy. So he's asking Canadians not only to tighten their belts, but to lower their expectation and their standard of living. This coming from the governor of the Bank of Canada.
But what was Diefenbaker's message after he fired Coyne?
Well, Diefenbaker's message after he fired Coyne is he put in a new governor of the Bank of Canada. The economy recovered quite strongly from a recession, and then Coyne went on, to become a chairman of a bank, and they asked him to resign from that after a scandal, and he refused to resign from that, as well.
All right, so we've set the record straight on the Coyne affair. When we come back from this quick break, I do want to ask you to set the record straight on the arrow, and then we'll get into the accomplishments of, I think, one of the most underrated prime ministers in Canadian history. Back in moments.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
So, Bob, I don't want to make the whole episode about the arrow. I think it is something that people talk about far too much, but there is popular perception, due to CBC and others, as you've noted, that he killed the Avro arrow, and this was the most advanced jet ever invented. And, the Americans only got to the moon because all the guys fired from that went to NASA, and we could have been this superpower on the defense side if he hadn't done this. What's the reality?
Well, if only, Brian, if only that was all true. But what is true was the Avro arrow was an engineering marvel, that it flew at an incredibly fast speed. Now, this is the arrow without any, military equipment or any ballistics equipment on it, no missiles. But it was a project that started off by working with an international consortium. The consortium ditched it. It became a made in Canada, all Canadian affair. But there was no need for it. It didn't respond to the military threats of the day.
What do you mean there was no need?
So we were in the midst of the Cold War. And at the time, if you were growing up in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and you were in grade school or high school, you were practicing in your classroom, hiding under your desks, because there was the Russians had acquired nuclear weapons, and that was the threat. This is just before the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Cold War was searing hot. And so, how do you defend against nuclear missiles coming in from Russia or elsewhere from a Warsaw Pact country? It's not with an interceptor flight. The defense requirements that the military were saying was, we need our own missiles. We need to defend against missiles. We need a Beaumark missile program. The interceptor flights, for surveillance, and they could only fly a short distance. They were very fast, but couldn't stay in the air for very long. We're not responding.
And they were designed to take down bombers, right?
Well,
and other take on fighter jets or bombers.
Now we have intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're not flying, at conventional speeds. These things are rockets, and the Avro arrow would be useless against it. On top of that, but we still needed some coverage. We still needed some air coverage. But the cost of this had gone up by more than 500%. And the only way that the Avro arrow could have been viable and feasible is if the technology we developed had a market around the world. If we could develop this and sell this, make it part of, the NATO complement, make it a standard. But there was no market whatsoever for this plane. For lots of reasons, including that the program had been infiltrated by a Russian spy, but that wasn't known specifically at the time. So the government of Louis Saint Laurent, the Liberal government, had determined to scrap the program. The recommendation from the Canadian military to the Louis Saint Laurent government was to scrap the program. We can't. It's too expensive. It doesn't meet our needs. Fancy, and an engineering marvel, but this is the wrong plane for our defense requirements. It needs to go. And this lands on Diefenbaker's lap. The Liberals did not make that decision because they were afraid that before an election it would be viewed negatively by the public who, were amped up about this jet. So they deferred the decision until after the election. Diefenbaker is left to make the decision when he's setting government priorities. Spending restrictions need to be put in place. The plane is a waste. It's a white elephant of epic proportions. And so he makes the very tough call. Some say it's because he was dictated to by the American government, that he was just following what they had told him to do. Anybody who studied John Diefenbaker knows that if he was told by the American government to cancel it, he would have been more likely to keep it than cancel it. He was not in bed with the Americans in any way. He made a tough call that every expert who's looked at it, who's looked at the evidence since then, and I went through all of the records, concluded that was the right call to make. But it became the subject of great conspiracy theories that, they had to destroy the planes and put them at the bottom of Lake Ontario. And, essentially none of that none of that is true, although it's perpetuated because, as I said, people never wanted to come to Diefenbaker's side. The Liberals would say, the Tories are like mumps. You get them once in your life. So they weren't going to come to his defense. And then there was the battle within the Conservative Party that he held on for leadership too long. And so, his defenders were few and far between. But canceling the Arrow was the right decision for Canada.
Well, claiming that he canceled the Arrow because he was, being dictated to by the Americans, you describe him fighting not one but two presidents in the book. He stood up to both Eisenhower and to Kennedy at different times.
He did. Certainly more so with Kennedy than was Eisenhower. I think they were more kindred spirits, maybe because of, the generation and the respect that Diefenbaker had because of Eisenhower's wartime record. But Eisenhower did not want China to come into the United Nations. Diefenbaker thought this was inevitable. They called him naive for thinking that could happen. Of course, he was right. Eisenhower did not want Canada to sell wheat to China. And Diefenbaker said, I'm elected by the people of Canada and by the farmers of Canada, and there's a market for our wheat. And so I'm not selling them strategic intelligence or weaponry. I'm selling them wheat. So he had battles with Eisenhower, but nothing compared to what he had with Kennedy. Kennedy despised Diefenbaker. Kennedy thought that Diefenbaker should do whatever he was told, and Diefenbaker didn't like that. He never wanted to be seen as a satellite of the United States. So, the title of my book is his fight for the subtitle, Canadian Independence. He viewed Canada as having a voice on the world stage, and it was a country that mattered, not because, it was friends with the United States, but we had virtue in our own right. And, it's why he loved Macdonald so much. Macdonald was the man who kept us out of the hands of the Americans and their manifest destiny. And Diefenbaker was a firm believer in the monarchy and the traditions and the Magna Carta and the petitions of rights and habeas corpus. He embraced all that tradition that came from Great Britain. So he wanted to keep his distance from the United States. And Kennedy didn't like it.
What do you think drove him to do things like extend the vote to First Nations, to look at someone like Douglas Young and say, this man's going to be in cabinet? It wasn't that long ago that Chinese Canadians couldn't be citizens. He's going to put them in cabinet and then send them to the United Nations. I love the story. I believe it was old video that I saw of Douglas Young saying he's at the United Nations sitting at the desk for Canada, and someone came over looking at him, this Chinese looking man, and they say, sorry, sir, you're at the desk for Canada. And he said, I speak for Canada.
Yeah, wonderful.
I mean, those would have been out of step with a lot of what people wanted or expected at the time. Same with putting Ellen Fairclough in cabinet. What drove him to take steps like that we're at the forefront, really, of moving the country forward?
Well, it goes back to where we started, which was he opposed any form of discrimination or prejudice of any kind, be it where your country of origin, the color of your skin, your sex. How can we be a great country if we're holding back anyone who can contribute to our greatness and potential? And so, and he was a longtime advocate for Indigenous people, and spoke about their contributions to Canada, how their over-contribution to Canada during the Second World War. The fact that without the support of the Indigenous people, we may not have won the War of 1812. He knew his history, so he wanted to bring all those forces together. When it came to South Africa, for example, South Africa would say, well, how can you lecture us on apartheid when you don't have any Indigenous people in your government? Which is, well, he might have said he did say, I can't lecture them when we don't have Canada free of discrimination. So he appointed Chief Gladstone, to the Senate of Canada to be the first parliamentarian to pave the way for Indigenous people to become parliamentarians. He was able to speak up at the Commonwealth against the British Prime Minister, who did not want South Africa to be removed from the Commonwealth, but he led the charge. He was a troublemaker, as the British Prime Minister said at the time, standing high and mighty and being sanctimonious about it. To Diefenbaker, it wasn't sanctimony. It was just pure equity. Giving Indigenous people the right to vote. The Liberals said you could have the right to vote if you surrender all your treaty rights, if you surrender your status. And Diefenbaker said, no, those treaties endure. They were made, by the Crown with Indigenous people, and that should not prohibit them from exercising democratic rights. So he said, you have open democratic rights, no conditions attached to it. This was freedom. This is why he would never join one of the clubs at the time, the private clubs that wouldn't let in blacks or Jews. He wouldn't go. This was not the conventional thinking at the time, and why he was seen somewhat as a troublemaker, because he made people who were attached to these institutions and clubs uncomfortable, but for a good reason. So this was just part of his character and who he was, and I don't think he struggled with it. I think he knew this was his purpose and his vision and his destiny, and he exercised it. He appointed the first Ukrainian to cabinet, and the people in Saskatchewan who spoke Ukrainian, were in tears thinking, I can't believe that there's a member of cabinet in our government who speaks our language, and who's representing our voices in cabinet. This is something that Diefenbaker was incredibly proud about, and the country should be proud about.
Well, I mean, those were remarkable steps, and removing the country of origin as a deciding factor on whether you could immigrate or not.
He changed the immigration system so that it became colorblind, and here's another brave thought. He took country of origin off the census. Because he said, what does it matter where you came from? You're Canadian now. He did not like the, hyphenating Canadians. In fact, he didn't even like English Canadian versus French Canadian. He thought we're all Canadians. But he didn't hesitate to appoint the first Francophone Governor General of Canada. He wanted to embrace Canada in all of its respects, in all its language and its cultural diversity.
The Bill of Rights. I guess, supplanted in many ways by the Charter. But it was a clearer, simpler document. It's still enforced, by the way, for people that don't realize that. And sometimes it does get cited in court decisions. It does happen from time to time. Would we have been better served if the Bill of Rights had stayed as it was instead of going to the Charter? Could they have altered the Bill of Rights a little bit just to keep it cleaner, more easy to understand, less convoluted than that thing that we got in 1984?
Well, whatever you think of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I certainly wrote a lot about it in my book on Pierre Trudeau, about how it came about and what its power and force would be. But the Bill of Rights, certainly, if you consider this an evolution, this was the first and very critical and important step. So this was a statement to say essentially that no law should be passed that is discriminatory in nature on religion, on sex, on a whole range of grounds. The problem with the Bill of Rights, and no one was talking about it at the time. This was, the political parties weren't talking about it. It was not on the agenda, and I don't think it got Diefenbaker many votes, but he felt it was the right thing to do. The problem was because it wasn't a constitutional amendment, it only applied to federal laws and federal domain. So it didn't apply to the provinces. So you could not, on the basis of the Bill of Rights, strike down a provincial law, on that basis, only a federal law. And you're right, it was used in the courts of law, particularly when a government bill or regulation was overtly discriminatory, particularly with respect to Indigenous people. So, you could consume, if you're an Indigenous person, you could consume alcohol on the reserve, but not off. And so this was, highly discriminating, and that law was struck down. But the Bill of Rights was all within the power structure of the federal parliament. The judiciary had some role in interpreting that bill, But the Charter of Rights changed that fundamentally. The Charter of Rights was a massive transfer of power away from Parliament and into the hands of the judiciary, where up until then they were basically arguing disputes between federal and provincial jurisdiction. Now all of a sudden, they were remaking social policy in Canada from the bench. But I would say that the Charter of Rights built on the foundation that existed in the Bill of Rights.
What's Diefenbaker's legacy in the end? We've talked about how he doesn't get credit for a lot of things, but does he have a legacy that Canadians should know about?
They should know about it, and his legacy is a strong one. He is a great prime minister, and as I said before, almost nothing that he did was undone, and in fact, it was reinforced by his successors. So his policy on not accepting American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, that was reversed by Lester Pearson. Pearson brought in American-controlled nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. Pierre Trudeau sent them back. And so that policy that Diefenbaker advocated for has been the policy of the federal government for the past 60 years. I think on the world stage, I've mentioned South Africa. Mm-hmm. This is a key part of his legacy, and it inspired not only people around the world, but certainly set a high watermark for Canadian prime ministers in standing up for discrimination. I encourage anyone who cares about Indigenous Canadians to read the book and what happened in the Parliament of Canada between 1940 and 1979 when Diefenbaker was there. What were the issues that they were facing? How did the government respond to them? How did Diefenbaker lead that charge and show respect and the admiration that he received from Indigenous people? That's certainly part of his legacy. His Roads to Resources project, developing the far north. And he used to say, don't give me these bureaucratic studies to say it's too expensive. We're changing the character and the nature of Canada by developing our resources and making these investments in our infrastructure. That's foundational to the prosperity that we enjoy today. That he believed...
Just as an aside on that, Bob, Stephen Harper picked up on that when he was in office. Trudeau kind of lost interest or never had interest in it. But I remember speaking to a Biden administration official about the trade irritants with Canada and why, because people think it's just under Republicans or Trump that there's issues. And they said, why won't you just get Gray's Point built, the port in Nunavut? It needs a road to get up there, to connect it, and it needs the port infrastructure. And it's just languishing. Now it might get built with these national projects of great importance, but the Americans wanted this stuff built. They wanted these roads to resources, as Diefenbaker called it. That is still an issue today that is resonating in Canada and was actually causing friction between the Trudeau government and the Biden government just a few months ago.
Well, without John Diefenbaker's vision and his leadership and his insistence, none of that would have happened between 1957 and 1963. He had over 6,000 kilometers of road built during that period. I mean, it would take us that long to study it today before it got off the ground. But he delivered it in additional rail lines. So this is a key part of his legacy. I've mentioned how he saw that there was a role for government in helping people who were poor through no fault of their own. He wasn't a laissez-faire guy. Built the foundation for hospital care in Canada. Stood up for Canadian independence and showed we didn't have to follow the American example. Stood up to the Soviets and the United Nations with a thundering speech, taking on Nikita Khrushchev, and show that Canada had a strong voice on the world stage. For conservatives, they should appreciate him because he turned a party of losers into a party of winners. They had lost 8 of the previous 9 elections, and John Diefenbaker comes around and wins 3 elections in a row. So he showed how conservatives and conservatism can actually be a winning force in Canadian politics and a national party. This was not and I should say that he believed in a truly national party with representation in all parts of the country. He was not a fan of social credit in the West, who he saw as a regionally based populist movement. He wanted a party that was relevant nationally, and that's what he built.
You've talked about the impact on the Conservative Party. I have to ask you as we close about two Liberals. He was famously saved by one, John Turner, while on vacation, almost drowning. But you've got the foreword in your book from Jean Chrétien, who says many nice things about him. And I love how Chrétien put it, that he was my opponent, not my enemy, and then harkens back to them being small-town lawyers. I know that you've spoken to Mr. Chrétien many times. What was his sense of John Diefenbaker?
So he saw John Diefenbaker as a man who loved his country, as a House of Commons man who respected the institution of Parliament, a great debater, a great speaker, a lot of the qualities that Chrétien has himself. You've mentioned they both come from small town lawyers, not from the elite institutions, sticking up for ordinary Canadians. They had that in common. But you'll also notice in the foreword that Jean Chrétien wrote is that John Diefenbaker could throw a punch below the belt. Now, that's his way of saying that he was highly competitive. He didn't agree with Diefenbaker. They had famous battles over the Canadian flag. The Liberals were instituting a new Canadian flag, and John Diefenbaker opposed it. But he could admire the courage and the conviction and the flair that John Diefenbaker possessed, and that he had a strong social conscience, which I think puts him in line with Diefenbaker. I don't think that he appreciated the attacks that many of Jean Chrétien's colleagues faced under Diefenbaker's wrath. So he didn't want to create the impression that they were friends in any way, but he could certainly admire his commitment, dedication, and love of Canada, and how he carried on a battle without becoming enemies. And in fact, in one of Jean Chrétien's books, when he was a backbencher, whenever Diefenbaker would take on a Liberal minister and really skewer them, they'd send notes over to Diefenbaker to congratulate them, because they thought this was that much easier for them to move into cabinet if he took one of the Liberal cabinet ministers down. So he appreciated that aspect of it to the extent that it advanced his career. So I think it says something about Jean Chrétien, a Liberal prime minister, that he's prepared to write a foreword to a book about a Conservative prime minister, about his love for Canada.
I think everyone that reads the book, Freedom Fighter, will have a greater appreciation for John Diefenbaker. Bob, thanks so much.
Brian, pleasure.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Hit that subscribe button, hit a like button wherever you're getting your podcast. Please help us out, leave a rating or a review, and tell your friends about us. Until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You. 2 years later, he was still opposition leader, and he lost again to the Pearson Liberals. Despite this, Diefenbaker doesn't resign as leader of the Progressive Conservatives, which put the party in an awkward situation that hasn't really happened before. The typical rules of a Canadian political party were that you stayed leader until you died or resigned. And if you lost twice in a row, you were supposed to do the honorable thing and step aside. But Diefenbaker just didn't, prompting the party to take the unprecedented step of forcing a party convention in Toronto for the singular purpose of crowbarring Diefenbaker out of the leadership. Diefenbaker shows up, pretends everything is fine, and gives a finger-wagging speech chastising his fellow party members for their disloyalty.
I followed this party when I didn't agree with policies. And I gave loyalty to leader after leader, because I believe that there is no other way.
He's politely cheered by the assembled Conservatives and then abjectly humiliated in their subsequent leadership vote. On the first ballot, Diefenbaker gets a distant 5th place, and even then he refuses to admit defeat.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.